Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is January 17th, 2023, Tuesday, January 17th, 2023. And today, let's start off with one of my favorites, which is true crime, and but the older type, the kind that for some reason just even what they call the good old days. Well, sometimes those good old days they had their mysteries. And this one is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Poison Dreams. It was a bitterly cold winter day when the body of Marion Lambert, 18, a high school girl, was found frozen in the snow near a clump of bushes at the edge of the Sacred Heart Academy grounds in Highland Park, Illinois. It was her father, Frank Lambert, the caretaker at the Jonas Krupenheimer estate, who found the body. It was a desolate place and a place known as Helm's Woods. She left in the morning for school and told her parents she would be home late since she had plans to attend a party. Police traced her steps. She had been at Lake Forest in the evening and then made her way down Green Bay Road towards her home. Though there were no marks of violence on her body and her clothing was undisturbed, people suspected it was a homicide. Her bracelet, watch, and a small amount of money, which had been knotted in a handkerchief, were not taken. The path she took from the Chicago-Milwaukee Railroad station at Sacred Heart Convent indicated a man was with her, and they walked for a mile before reaching the place where her body was found. There was no evidence she'd been sexually assaulted. The police followed a track left by a man's shoes that circled the body and then went straight off in a straight line to the railway tracks where they were lost. The police were leading towards suicide by poison, but pending the outcome of the analysis of her stomach and also a rumor she had met her sweetheart, William Orpett, who had come from out of town to see her, they waited to decide if foul play was involved. Miriam and William were both children of gardeners who worked on the estates of the wealthy on the outskirts of Chicago. William was 3 years older than Marion, and they attended school together when they were younger. He finished high school and went off to the University of Wisconsin to study journalism. She flirted with other boys, but William Orpett held a special place in her heart. In the spring of 1915, he wrote her a letter that read, "I'm afraid you'll forget all about me down there, and that would be the finish of yours truly. I want to see you badly, dearest, and want you badly. If I could get my arm around you now and get you up close to you and kiss the life out of you, I would be happy." That summer, when William came home to Lake Forest, the pair started an intimate relationship. Supposedly, after the summer, when Will returned to the university, she told him she was pregnant. She confessed this to her friend Josephine Davis. That fall, William's letter became more casual, and soon Marion found out he was interested in another girl who lived in Madison. William didn't totally cut communications with Marion, since he had the cloud of an unwanted pregnancy hanging over his head. There were other circumstances that cast doubt on the suicide theory. The positioning of her body was described thus. She was found lying upon her left side, with her left hand resting under her head. She was a right-handed girl, yet in the crook of her arm were her school books. It doesn't seem possible that if she took the poison herself with her right hand, that she still would have held the books in that position as she toppled over in the snow, and the books wouldn't have been in that position if she first laid down in the snow, placing her left hand under her head and then took the poison. It looks as if somebody placed those books in the crook of her arm after she lay helpless in the snow, and that they also carefully placed her head resting on her left hand. Eventually it was determined that Marion Frances Lambert had taken a subtle but violent poison. It was cyanide of potassium. However, no container for the substance was found by her body. Crystals of the poison were found in her hair and beneath her fingernails. A schoolmate of Marion described seeing a young man hiding behind a tree near where the girl's body was discovered. She said he had an evil face and staring eyes. She had seen the same man at the same spot 3 months before. Eventually, Orpett was summoned by the police. His father said that his son was involved with another girl and that he could account for all of the boy's time. He had a landlady and a clergyman who could corroborate this. By February 12th, William H. Orpett confessed to having knowledge of Marion's death. He said he met her in the woods after writing her a letter to meet there. He said she pleaded with him for 2 hours to renew their relationship. He told her no. As he left her, she swallowed the poison that killed her. He had no idea where she got the poison or that she had intentions of using it. He told authorities that he had fallen in love with Celeste Yauker, a chemical instructor in the Normal College at DeKalb, Illinois, and intended to marry her. This is when the motive for the murder materialized for the state. Initially, it was reported that the relationship between Orpet and Lambert was less serious, but there were hints that she had been ruined by her passion. In other words, she was driven to suicide because she had sex with a boy who she thought would marry her, but eventually he got cold feet. Prosecutors charged that William Orpet had given Marion poison to get rid of her, because he believed she was pregnant with his child, and this would prove to be an impediment in marrying his new love, Celestia Yauker. Within 3 weeks of the discovery of the girl's body, William Orpet was held for her murder. He pled not guilty. Celestia Yauker was called the other woman. A reporter who went to interview Celestia discovered that she was not even engaged to William Orpet, and she had not heard of Marion Lambert until the tragedy of the girl's suicide. Her character was slandered by innuendos printed in many newspapers that followed the story throughout the country. The case became contentious when in March 1916, Judge C.C. Edwards of Waukegan granted Orpet a change of venue. Soon after, the newspapers claimed the judge received a death threat. The letter ended, "If you free him by not letting him stand trial, you will never have but a few more chances for yourself, for we will get you, too. You may laugh now, but you won't. Yours in warning." Only initials were at the end, and police believed it had been composed by a woman. Amidst the turmoil of the investigation, Orpet's father, Edward Owen Orpet, was sued for slander in April by another gardener named John Tiplady, who claimed that Orpet Sr. had been peddling a story that when he was employed as a gardener by A.B. Dix, he traded a number of rare and very valuable plants with another Lake Forest gardener, and then sold the plants which he received in the trade to a Highland Park florist. It was suspected the suit was brought about because his son was accused in the murder of Marion Lambert, and that public opinion was against William Orpet even before the trial had started. During his last visit to see Marion, Will did a lot of strange things before boarding the train. He wrote a letter to her that said, "If everything is not all right by the time I see you, it will be then." He also swore her to secrecy regarding his visit. Then he wrote 2 more letters, one to his mother and the last to an unknown person. He asked a college friend to send them from Madison on Wednesday morning, which is when he would be in Lake Forest. In other words, he was establishing an alibi that would place him somewhere else. He later explained he did these things because his parents would have been angered to learn he had left a university campus. Will sneaked into a garage on the McCormick estate where his father worked and slept in a little room upstairs. As planned, his family didn't know he had returned to Forest Lake. The night before Marion was found, her friend Josephine Davis was spending the night with her. The next morning, Marion told her she had to post a letter and did not continue to school. The trial started May 15th. It took 3 full weeks to find jurors. In the process, 1,286 jurists were called, and 1,203 were examined before 8 were chosen. William Orpet's mother was ordered by the judge to stop kissing her son when she went into court and when she left to go home. This, of course, was requested by the state attorneys. Supposedly, Orpet asked a student friend, Charles Hassinger, who worked at a drugstore, to procure a powerful drug, which it was inferred would produce a miscarriage. He asked the same friend to find a physician with not too many scruples. It was understood that Will wanted someone to perform an abortion in case the drug didn't work. But there was one secret that Marion never divulged to her lover, which was that she was not carrying his child. Later, an autopsy of her body confirmed she was not pregnant and never had been, according to the report issued by the Cook County Coroner's Office. The defense presented a schoolmate of Marion who said he found her alone in the chemical laboratory of the school just before she died. He said there was a cyanide of potassium, both liquid and solid, on the shelves nearby. Then the chemistry professor at the high school said he had recently given a lesson that included a paragraph about cyanide of potassium. He said the students were not supposed to take supplies, but the lock to the storeroom didn't work. The state had 2 main witnesses: Josephine Davis, Marion's friend, and another was David James, a deaf and dumb teamster who said he saw the couple in the woods the morning of the murder. He said he saw the boy press a bottle to the girl's lips. The problem with that is that neither the prosecution or the defense knew where the poison had come from. Either Will or Miriam could have obtained it from the chemical laboratories of their school. Both of their fathers kept cyanide for their work on the estate grounds. Then events took a turn for the worse for the prosecution. Hassinger, the drug clerk, vacillated on his testimony as to whether Orpit had bought the bottle. James the teamster could not positively identify Will as the young man he had seen in the woods. Lastly, Josephine Davis, who had started out as a witness for the prosecution, ended up a witness for the defense. She said that Marion had threatened to commit suicide. After a telephone call with Orpit the day before her death, she said, "If Bill throws me over and marries that other girl, I'll kill myself." Other witnesses testified that Josephine was in love with William Orpet herself. The prosecution could not provide direct proof that Orpet had poison, and Marion didn't. The defense established that Marion had killed herself because she knew she'd lost the boy she loved. Orpet's blossoming romance with Celestia Yauker met with a decisive end when the prosecution urged her to write Will a letter while he was in jail awaiting the trial, since he was denied bail. The contents were dictated by Mr. Dady, the prosecutor. In a short note, she urged him to tell all. She wrote, quote, "I know you have done it for love of me. You once said you would kill anyone who came between us." He returned a note stating, "Your letter's all bunk. Goodbye then. Don't come near here." All her letters to him were returned as well. Eventually, the tiebreaker in Orpet's favor with the jury is that the defense team verified the poison that killed Marion Lambert was powdered potassium cyanide, and not the type his father kept for work on the estate, which was sodium cyanide. There was also allegations that evidence had been tampered with. Two members of the coroner's jury were called by the defense to testify there was no spots on Marion's coat when it was produced with other clothing at the inquest. However, now it had 3 drops of cyanide poison. The crux of the case rested on the allegations that the prosecution said that Marion had been poisoned when the cyanide had been dissolved in water, and the defense claimed she had committed suicide by taking the poison in powder form. Ultimately, William Orpet was found not guilty. By 1917, William Orpet's family had relocated to California. However, William's exact whereabouts were unknown. There were rumors that the men of Lake Forest were planning to coat his body with tar and feathers if he appeared on the streets of the city. After the sensational trial, Orpet changed his name to William Dawson. Orpet faded from the headlines until 1920, when he applied for marriage license in San Francisco. He had joined the military during World War I and met his wife Olga Margaret Sarnowski in Detroit. Even years after the end of the trial, whenever a similar case presented itself, there was a comparison made with the death of Marion Lambert. Well, talk about being found not guilty but being punished anyway. But we continue. If there was any revenge from the grave, Marion got hers. When the romance she killed herself over ended and was never given a chance to flower again. By Will Orpet's own admission, he planned to marry Celestia Yauker, but with the tragedy of Marion's suicide between them, he was desperate to alienate himself from anything that existed during that terrible year of 1916. For many months afterwards, Celestia was followed by newspaper reporters who kept asking her if she had resumed her romance with Orpet. The 3 trees growing together in Helms Wood, where Marion's body was found, were hacked to pieces by souvenir hunters. Dady and Jocelyn lost their offices as state attorneys due to their inability to get Orpet convicted. Celestia Yauker married Colonel Lloyd Merrill Boyce and gave birth to a daughter in 1934 named Barbara. William Orpet's dream of becoming a journalist died the summer he went on trial. He joined the Air Force during World War I and achieved the rank of sergeant. Eventually, he moved to California to join his parents and, like his father, became a gardener. He divorced Olga and married Catherine Swan Pender, who was a divorcee with 2 sons. He lingered the last 2 years of his life at the National Military Home in Los Angeles. He suffered from peptic ulcers and died from a massive left cerebral malacia. He was 52 years old. His wife Catherine had died the year before in 1947. The shadow cast by Marion Lambert's death followed him his entire life. This is the alternate ending. If for one moment we view Marion as a young woman who was obsessed, capable of seeking revenge against the man she loved, even if ultimately it meant her death, we could see a chain of premeditation that started months before she died. Perhaps that last summer she spent with Will Orpit, she realized he had no intentions of ever marrying her. This could have motivated her to have premarital sex with him, something that in those years was strongly frowned upon by society, and could have forced him to marry her. Had she been planning to use the threat of pregnancy even then? But there must have been some part of her that suspected that she could not bend him to her will, and she went prepared to commit the ultimate act of self-destruction, which would tarnish him by association alone. This, perhaps, was Marion's vengeance for her unrequited love. Yes, and even back then, this was over 100 years ago, you think these young innocent girls, who would have thought that she would come up with all these machinations as how she was going to get her man. And if a person becomes obsessed, especially when you're that age, you do stupid stuff like that. Like, if I can't have you, no one can, I'll threaten you with a pregnancy that didn't work. Okay, well, now I'm going to take my life, and that kind of deal. It's unfortunate, but there you go. And unfortunately, William Orpit, he was not found guilty, but he paid for it. The rest of his life, he paid for it. Okay, the next story is out of Life Science, and it is titled Lasers Reveal Massive 650 Square Mile Maya Site Hidden Beneath Guatemalan Rainforest. Geologists in northern Guatemala have discovered a massive Maya site that stretches approximately 650 square miles and dates to the middle and late Preclassic period, which is roughly 1000 BC to 250 BC. The findings were the result of an aerial survey that researchers conducted via airplane using LiDAR, light detection and ranging, in which lasers are beamed out and the reflected light is used to create aerial imagery of a landscape. The technology is particularly beneficial in areas such as the rainforest of Guatemala's Mirador Calakmul karst basin, where lasers can penetrate the thick tree canopy. Using data from the scans, the team identified more than 1,000 settlements dotting the region, which were interconnected by 100 miles. Causeways that the Maya likely traversed on foot. They also detected the remains of several large platforms and pyramids, along with canals and reservoirs used for water collection, according to the study, which was published in the journal Ancient Mesoamerica. The LiDAR data showed for the first time an area that was integrated politically and economically and never seen before in other places in the Western Hemisphere. Study co-author Carlos Morales Aguilar, a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Texas at Austin, told Life Science in an email, "We can now see the entire landscape of the Maya region in this section of Guatemala," he said. So, what made this region so enticing that the Maya would want to settle there in the first place? For the Maya, the Mirador Calakmul karst basin was the Goldilocks zone. A geologist has said with the Institute for Geological Study of the Maya Lowlands in Houston. The Maya settled in this region because it had the right mix of uplands for settlement and lowlands for agriculture. The uplands provide a source for limestone, the primary building material, and dry land to live on. The lowlands are mostly swamps or bajos, which provided for wetland agriculture as well as organic rich soil for use in terraced agriculture. Researchers have previously used LiDAR to scan Maya sites in Guatemala. In 2015, an initiative called the Mirador Basin Project conducted two large-scale surveys of the southern portion of the basin, focusing on the ancient city of El Mirador. That project led to the mapping of 658 square miles of this section of the country, according to the study. When I generated the first bare earth models of the ancient city of El Mirador, I was blown away, Morales Aguilar said. It was fascinating to observe, for the first time, the large number of reservoirs, monumental pyramids, terraces, residential areas, and small mounds. Researchers hope that LiDAR technology will help them explore sections of Guatemala that have remained a mystery for centuries. That's very interesting because the thing is this, you discover them, but because of that LiDAR, But to go in there and find it, that is altogether different because that is very, very thick jungle. Very thick jungle. And to go in there, and first of all, there's basically it's a rainforest and there's poisonous things. Just to get to it, that's before they. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. So that's I find is very interesting though because normally before um, the only way that they would ever come across this is by mistake. You know, somebody discovered something. Um, how can I say it? Uh, it was just happenstance sometimes, and that they would find a corner of something, and now basically that's taken care of. You don't have to worry about that. Let's see. Hold on. Here we go. And this other one is this is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's called The Ballad of Cat Eye Annie. It was December 1923 when headlines blasted "Seek Cat Eye Annie for Suriname gem theft." You may ask, who is Cat Eye Annie? She was one of the most notorious jewel thieves of the early 20th century. I'd never heard of this lady. Her real name was Lillian McDowell, but she also went by the aliases of Elsie Webb, Martha Connors, Lillian Redmond. She was 40 years old and she had earned her moniker of Cat Eye because of one unique feature she possessed. Her eyes were pale blue, but one of them was part blue and brown. She weighed only about 120 pounds and stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. Cat Eye was a plain woman with brownish hair streaked with gray. Her last theft was worth $75,000 of gems from the home of Louis J. Sudram, who lived at 464 Linwood Avenue. She stole them using a ruse which had worked many times in the past for her. The police termed the method maid robbery. By then, the authorities in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and other cities were seeking the elusive jewel thief. She had also skipped out on a $2,000 bail bond. Annie no doubt was a rogue, but she was an ingenious one. One of the last heists started when she arrived in Cleveland after leaving Detroit. She rented an apartment on the west side close to the Surdam home. Annie advertised in the newspaper for a maid who could furnish excellent references. She would specify that there were no children, no washing to be done, and the pay was good. When the applicants came forward, she took the names of the references furnished by the applicants and told each of them to come back in a few days. She then used the references when she applied for a position at the Surdam home. Mrs. Surdam immediately engaged her. Within 6 hours of starting her position, she had fled with the jewelry, but that was after she had tied Mrs. Surdam to a chair. Ironically, Cat Eye had been convicted about a dozen years before of a robbery a block from the Surdam property at the home of Edward Hofeller. Then she was given a suspended sentence after she stole more than $3,000 in jewelry. She had gained entry into the household the same way by applying for a position. Little was known about Lillian's early history, but her criminal record started when she married John McDowell, alias H. Grant, a well-known Western criminal who police believed helped his wife in the Surdam theft. The couple's first crime occurred in Pittsburgh on December 20th, 1906, when they threw a brick through the window of a jewelry store and grabbed handfuls of gems. Grant was caught 2 blocks away and sentenced to serve 10 years in prison. Lillian eluded capture for 2 weeks until she was found in Chicago and returned to Pittsburgh, where she was found not guilty. There was another story that appeared on the same date which coincided much closer with the methods that Lillian Cat Eye Annie would use successfully for many years after this. The story read: $4,000 in jewels stolen. This was December 19th in New York. Jewels valued at more than $4,000 were stolen from the residence of Joseph Velga in Central Park West on December 5th, and a reward of $500 has been offered for their return and the arrest of Gabriel Hilt and Louise Lewis. who were employed as servants in the Vega home. Hilt and Miss Lewis had been in Mr. Vega's employ only a few days. It was around then that she became a maid thief, and the police did not hear from her until December 23rd, 1910, when she stole $6,000 worth of jewelry from a St. Louis home where she had been employed. She was acquitted even though identified as a thief because the jewelry was not found. While waiting for this trial to conclude, Chicago police notified St. Louis they wanted Cat Eye for stealing jewelry valued at $3,000 from another home where she had worked in. In Chicago, her luck turned and she was convicted and sentenced to serve 1 to 10 years in Joliet prison. While serving time, Mr. Hofeller identified her as a servant that stole property valued at $3,000. Once released, the Buffalo Police Department picked her up. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, however, the judge deferred sentence and allowed her to go free. It wasn't until April 1924 that Cat Eye Annie was arrested in San Francisco and she was turned over to the Los Angeles Police Department to answer to a burglary charge. A circular with her picture was sent to various police departments. With her 20 aliases, it was difficult to verify who she was. The authorities verified that none of the Surdam jewels had been found, but there was a good reason for this, because who they had arrested was not Cat Eye Annie. It was only another female thief that was copying her methods and had been successful in pulling off 4 jobs. She convinced the authorities she was not Annie because she did not possess the pale blue eyes with the lower part of the left pupil cleft with brown. Then the newspapers headlined with, "Where is Cat Eye Annie?" Not until February 1925 did another headline related to Cat Eye Annie surface, and again it detailed her arrest in Baltimore on a robbery charge. It was reported that this time she had an accomplice named Edward Lewis, 58, who supposedly aided in the Surdam robbery. Again, there was no sign of the jewels. Prior to this, she had stolen jewels in Buffalo valued at $75,000 and then $100,000 for a Boston job. Then, 3 days later, the police retracted their report when they realized they had the wrong person and Cat Eye Annie was still out and about. It was September 1925, and authorities in Milwaukee said one of their detectives had noted a woman with 2 colored pupils riding on a streetcar. He followed her to an ultra-fashionable East Side residence and arrested her. She was using the name of Mary McCoy. Within days, 2 detectives from Buffalo were headed to Milwaukee to pick up Cat Eye Annie. Lillian McDowell was intelligent and persistent. When the detectives from Buffalo were taking her from the city hall to the jail after arraignment, she had not been handcuffed, and upon reaching Franklin and Church Street, she broke away from the officer and ran. She was overtaken easily. It was reported that when brought into the detective bureau, she slumped in a faint. However, it was known this was one of her stalls. Any questions that were posed to her, she would answer with, "I can't remember." When appearing before the judge, she gave her name as Julia Archer, as well as Harriet Ginther, Mary McCoy, and Lillian McDowell. She pled not guilty and was remanded to jail for trial. Her fainting fits were so common that Detective Fitzgerald, who brought her back from Milwaukee, remarked, "I'm becoming a human elevator for the woman. All I do is carry her around." On October 14, 1925, she pled guilty to a charge of first-degree grand larceny. The maximum penalty would be 10 years in Auburn prison. She pretended to faint and then again made a sprint for liberty but was captured by a deputy. She was sentenced to 10 years. Everything connected to Cat Eye Annie made the papers, including the death of Catherine B. Gunn, chief of Buffalo's policewoman. In her obituary, it was mentioned that she'd once been a pharmacist and dentist, and of course that she was one of the policewomen who caught Cat Eye Annie in Milwaukee. Once jailed, Cat Eye obtained privileges by becoming an amiable prisoner. She was permitted to do her own ironing, and within weeks of starting her sentence, she slipped a piece of rubber into the lock at the end of the cell corridor and then went to bed. She was missing the next morning. In her bed, jail guards found some clothing wrapped in a coat to form a dummy. This, of course, was to trick anyone looking into her cell that she was still there. She made a getaway after the matrons left the corridor to change watches. Going through the door in which she had placed the piece of rubber, she reached a stairway leading to the sheriff's office. She dropped from a window and landed on Delaware Avenue and vanished. Except the fall broke her ankle and she limped to a trolley stop. She took a car to the suburbs where she hid in an unoccupied house. waiting for the ankle to mend. Workmen found her there, and the law soon followed. Anxious to be done with a jailbreaker, the sheriff asked that she be taken immediately to Auburn, which was the state prison. For her trouble, she was placed in solitary confinement. Lillian McDowell, aka Cat Eye Annie, made her escape from solitary confinement in Auburn prison by digging through an 18-inch wall. For weeks, she chipped away at a hole in back of her bed using a spoon and fork stolen from the kitchen. She loosened the brick and mortar wall and hid the pieces in her mattress. Sleeping on the rubble did not deter her from making an escape. On May 10, 1926, she scaled the high wall enclosing the prison by climbing up a plank she had carried from the prison greenhouse. The guards still couldn't explain how she obtained the tools she used. Since she had a slim body, she wiggled through the opening she made into the prison yard. The weather, though, worked against her. Since the temperature was very cold, all she was wearing was a light prison dress. Annie was discovered by a farmer the following day in a hayfield on a farm near Weedsport. She tried to endure the frigid cold by burying herself in a pile of hay, but she suffered from exposure and was close to developing pneumonia. In March 1927, she was committed to the insane asylum at Matawan. It was unknown what caused the prison to send her there. Perhaps it was the fact that she had been kept in solitary until then. Among the inmates, there was a saying that covered Matawan, Dannemora, and the other state institutions, which was, "They never come back." However, in the case of Annie, they allowed one eyelid to drop just a trifle. Matawan is easier to beat than Auburn. Expectations were that Annie would try to escape from Matawan. It was rumored among the inmates that the reason Cat Eye stayed free as long as she had was because she worked alone, or what was called a lone wolf. She didn't have pals to squeal, and there was no cut on the swag. She pocketed all the proceeds. Previous to her first arrest, the description of Cat Eye was wide and varied, but after the first pinch, it gave the Dicks the first description of her. This is when they took the first photograph. What it did for Cat Eye is that it gave her the first prison to beat. In May of 1930, the intrepid Cat Eye Annie cut the lock from her cell, put on the warden's hat and coat, and made a getaway. She had already made trousers from a blanket. Among her talents, Cat Eye was a born mimic. She walked briskly to the main gate just the way the acting warden did every day. At the gate she saluted and nodded as he did. She headed east, walking through fields until she reached the Senate Road. She was no fool and knew the alarm was already raised. However, she risked hitching a ride, but luck was not on her side that day. George Gronin picked her up and recognized her immediately. Another witness was the wife of a state trooper that saw her getting into the car. Before long, roadblocks were set up. Gronin tried to take her back to Auburn, and she pulled out a pair of scissors and threatened him with them. His ordeal ended when they stopped at a state police roadblock. It's not clear if 2 or 7 years were added to her sentence. In 1933, all the female prisoners were transferred to Bedford Hills from Auburn. It was said the Salvation Army had converted Annie to Christianity. In 1935, after serving her 10-year sentence, she was sent to St. Louis to start serving an 8-year one. Cat Eye might have found Jesus, but she hadn't lost her desire to become free. In 1937, she took a 20-foot drop from a bathroom window which injured the 55-year-old and instead landed her in the hospital. She had taken a bedsheet and at 2:30 a.m. slid out the window. A shout from a yard guard caused her to release her grip on the sheet and she fell down. This was her second attempt only 2 months after she arrived at the prison. Sometime in the late 1930s or early 1940s, she was released. This time she escaped into anonymity and her fate remained unknown. There is reason to believe her real maiden name was Lillian or Lily Hart. She was born in 1881 and wed John Donar or Dorwar, a corruption of McDowell, on December 25, 1881 in Manhattan. She was 16 years old and her husband 22. However, with Cat Eye's penchant for subterfuge, all this information could be false or a corruption of her true name. Cat Eye Annie was one who understood very well the power of anonymity. I couldn't get over that lady. I'd never heard of her, but she was incredible. And let me tell you, $75,000, $100,000, $5,000, those sums at the turn of the century and into the 20s was equivalent to millions as far as value. if we looked at the how much money she actually got away with. Okay, let's go on to the next story out of Vintage News, and it's titled Lisa Marie's Death Has Eerie Similarities to Her Father. The death of Lisa Marie Presley, the only child of Elvis Presley, on January 12, 2023, came as a shock to the world. At only 54, she died young, just like her father. Yet there are other devastating connections between their deaths that were pointed out by fans shortly after the news of her passing broke. Others have remarked that these similarities extend far beyond these two members of the Presley family. First and only child, Lisa Marie was born to Elvis and Priscilla Presley on February 1st, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, 9 months after the two were married. Lisa Marie was the only child that the singer would ever have, and she was always very close with her father. Even years after his death, she recalled, I knew that he was crazy about me. He was known to spoil her, giving her extremely expensive gifts throughout her childhood. In one instance, he took her to Idaho on his private jet, which would eventually be named Lisa Marie, so that she could play in the snow for an hour. As a child, she thought this was normal and that it was simply the way all fathers showed that they loved their daughters. Although her parents eventually divorced, Lisa Marie remained close to both of them, living with her mother most of the time but frequently visiting Elvis up until his death. Sadly, Lisa Marie lost her father when she was only 9 years old. Not only did she have to experience this loss, but she was also in the home the night Elvis died. He kissed her goodnight, and it wasn't until she was alerted to him dead in the bathroom that she saw him again. As Priscilla and Elvis had divorced, Lisa Marie became heir to his Graceland home and the rest of his estate alongside her grandfather, Vernon. He also, however, died soon after, and everything became hers to manage when she reached the age of 25. Losing her father had a profound impact on Lisa Marie and was something she recounted in many interviews later in life. In one instance, she remembered, his body was in the house for 3 days, and there was something very oddly comforting about that, which made it not necessarily real to me. Fast forward many years to the announcement of Lisa Marie's death, and the similarities between the two tragedies are clear. She was rushed to the hospital, having been found unresponsive in her home after going to cardiac arrest. Although she was given a pacemaker and put on life support in the ICU, she passed away later in the day. Her mother Priscilla announced the news saying she was the most passionate, strong, and loving woman I have ever known. Both Lisa Marie and her father were found in their homes unconscious, having died from heart complications. While many people experience incidences like this, many members of the Presley family have died from heart attacks and complained about similar symptoms to Lisa Marie and Elvis leading up to these events. The connection, according to at least one writer, may have been in their genetics. Following her death, Lisa Marie was fondly remembered by those who knew her for her philanthropic work, her music, and her personality. I was reading an article about this, and really, mostly what it points to was that one of her children, a son, I believe was either in his 20s, committed suicide by shooting himself, I believe it was. And this was very, very difficult for her. When you read the description of what she was thinking, um, I think he died like maybe 2 years ago. This really, as I could understand, this I think was basically what really led to her death. You hear of people dying of a broken heart. Well, yeah, technically, how's that? You could look at that and say, well, she died of cardiac arrest, but I think that a contributing factor more than anything was the loss of her son. Okay, and we're going to go up to ancient origins, and this is titled "Eight Shipwrecks That Still Hold Promise of Treasure and Fame." We all love a good mystery, and what's better than a treasure hunt? This has led many historians to an obsession with finding lost shipwrecks. Some of them do it in the hope of finding lost Spanish galleons filled with gold. Some do it just because they love the hunt. Over the centuries, countless vessels have been lost beneath the waves, including warships, pirate ships, and trade vessels. Finding them is time-consuming and expensive, and bringing them back to the surface even more so. Here are some of the most famous and valuable shipwrecks still lost at sea. Number 1, the Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship. The Santa Maria may just be the most famous ship on this list. When Christopher Columbus first set sail on his infamous first voyage to the Americas, to the Americas on August 23rd, 1492, he took three ships with him, the Niña da Pinta and the Santa Maria. Luckily, with the help of local natives, the Santa Maria was Columbus's flagship, but not for long. On Christmas Eve 1492, the helmsman handed over the ship's wheel to an inexperienced cabin boy while he went for a nap. Unsurprisingly, the cabin boy didn't know what he was doing and promptly sailed the ship straight into the nearest coral reef just off modern-day Haiti. Luckily, with the help of local natives, the crewmen managed to quickly empty the ship's hold of cargo and provisions. The ship sank the following day and is believed to have been buried by sediment. Today, the ship's precise location is a mystery. The closest explorers have gotten was in 2014 when an underwater explorer named Barry Clifford claimed to have found the Santa Maria by using the information hidden in Columbus's journal. A team of UNESCO experts came in to verify the claims but found proof the wreck Clifford had found was much later, either 17th or 18th century in origin. The Santa Maria remains the holy grail for underwater explorers looking to make a name for themselves. Excuse me. Number 2. The HMS Endeavour, the sad fate of Cook's ship. Perhaps it's a good thing the Santa Maria sank. It was spared the depressing fate of the HMS Endeavour. The HMS Endeavour was the ship of the famous British explorer Captain James Cook during his first voyage of discovery. From 1768 to 1771, Cook used the HMS Endeavour to explore the Pacific Ocean. It was the first ship to circumnavigate New Zealand and the first European ship to reach Australia's eastern coast. Unfortunately, a few years after Cook's first voyage and return home, the Endeavour was sold. It ended up in the hands of a private buyer who cared little for the ship's heritage and renamed it the Lord's Sandwich, a little less impressive sounding. Then, during the American Revolution, it was chartered by the British Royal Navy, which used it to carry troops to New England. This became the ship's undoing. While moored in Rhode Island's Newport Harbor in 1778, the Endeavour and 12 other ships were sacrificed to form a blockade against an incoming French fleet. While modern historians know where Endeavour's remains should be, they still haven't been found. Both the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project and Australian National Maritime Museum have spent the last few years searching the waters surrounding Newport for the ship's rotting remains. They have had some success and claimed in early 2022 to have found the ship. However, many experts feel their claim was premature, and more research must be done to prove that what they found is not one of the 11 other ships sunk that day. Number 3. Bonhomme Richard, a plucky old frigate. Not all lost shipwrecks are those of explorers. For naval ships, being lost at sea comes with the territory. Take example the Bonhomme Richard, an aging frigate donated to the Continental Navy by the French during the American Revolution. Commanded by Captain John Paul Jones, the Bonhomme Richard set sail in 1779 and soon proved that its age didn't mean it was still a formidable ship. In just a few weeks, it managed to capture 16 British vessels. Then, on September 23rd of the same year, it went toe-to-toe with the HMS Serapis just off the northeast coast of England. It was a brutal naval battle that had begun with the cocky English telling Jones to surrender as his aging ship had no chance against one of the English Navy's best. The English turned out to be wrong, and Jones and his men did indeed manage to capture the HMS Serapis. Unfortunately, it came at a cost. The Bonhomme Richard had caught fire during the battle and received several fatal hits below its waterline. Jones and his crew spent 36 hours trying to save their plucky ship, but ultimately had to let her sink into the icy waters of the North Sea. Today, the Bonhomme Richard is one of the most searched for lost ships in the world. Everyone from British locals and professional salvage companies to the U.S. Navy has looked for it. A few explorers have found wrecks that seem to fit the Bonhomme Richard's description, but not have been confirmed yet. The number 4, Flor de la Mar's sunken treasure. The previous ships on this list are largely sought after due to their historical importance. However, very often underwater explorers have a very different reason for searching for these wrecks: financial gain. The Flor de la Mar is believed to have a hold full of diamonds, gold, and other untold riches when it sank. In 1511, the ship was called to assist Portugal's conquest of Malacca. The 400-ton ship had had a successful 9-year career, but its best years were behind it. At this point, it had a reputation for springing leaks and constantly needing repairs. After the successful conquest of Malacca, it was laden with valuables and set sail back home to Portugal, despite the fact that it had been officially deemed unsafe. It never made it. On November 20th, 1511, somewhere near the Strait of Malacca, it hit a fierce storm and sank. While some of the crew survived, many more drowned. Experts believe the ship was carrying roughly $2.6 billion worth of treasures when it sank. Various salvage companies and explorers have searched for this lost treasure trove, most notably treasure hunter Robert Marks, who has spent $20 million so far searching for the Flor de la Mar. So far, he hasn't made his money back. Number 5. The Merchant Royal, a fortune lost off the Cornish coast. It's not just the Spanish and Portuguese who had a nasty habit of losing ships laden with treasures at sea. The English also lost their fair share. The most painful was probably the Merchant Royal, which sank in 1641. It was a trade ship that had been carrying gold and silver, which if found today would be worth tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. The most galling thing about the loss of the Merchant Royal is where it sank. Not in enemy waters or in far-off lands, but just off Land's End in Cornwall. The ship was sailing back to London after a successful trading trip in the West Indies when it sprang a serious leak. The ship was already well over its recommended load and was in a poor state. Hitting a patch of rough weather was a final straw, causing its pumps to break down. It was all too much, and the ship sank. The Merchant Royal is often referred today as the El Dorado of the seas, due to the fact that it is believed to hold around $1.5 billion worth of gold. Amateur treasure hunters and marine archaeologists alike have searched the waters of Cornwall for the ship. In 2007, a team from Odyssey Marine Exploration caused a stir when they found a wrecked ship they believed to be the Merchant Royal. Coins recovered from the wreck showed it to be a Spanish frigate. However, in 2019, the Merchant Royal's anchor was found, but the location of the ship itself remains a mystery. Number 6. Le Griffon, lost in the Great Lakes. Not all ships are lost at sea. The Le Griffon, or Griffin as it was known, was a French ship that operated in America's Great Lakes during the 1760s. She was the first sailing ship to cruise the Great Lakes and was a three-masted ship built by the French explorer René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle. He had used the ship during an early expedition to the North American frontier. He sailed her to Niagara River and used her to explore parts of Lake Erie. Le Griffon's last trip came in September 1679 when she set sail from Green Bay into Lake Michigan. She was carrying a small crew of 6 men and a cargo of furs for trade. Her destination was Mackinac Island, but she never made it. Today her fate is a mystery. All we know is the ship, along with her crew and cargo, were all lost. There are two prevailing theories. The first is that the ship hit a heavy storm and sank. The second is that the ship mutinied, stole the cargo, and scuttled the ship. The ship is often referred to as the Holy Grail of Great Lakes shipwrecks, and various teams over the years have searched for it. There was much excitement in 2014 when two treasure hunters claimed to have found the ship, but rather embarrassingly, the discovery turned out to be a steam-powered ship from the 19th or 20th century. Number 7. USS Indianapolis sunk by the Japanese. The youngest entry on our list is the USS Indianapolis, which sank in 1945. The ship was a Portland-class heavy cruiser of the United States Navy. The ship had a distinguished service history, having served as the flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance from 1943 to 1944 during the Fifth Fleet's battles during World War II. Having survived many battles during the war, the Indianapolis met its ultimate fate just after a top-secret mission. It had just completed a high-speed delivery of uranium and other bomb components meant for Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat, to Tinian Naval Base. When it was ambushed by the Japanese submarine I-58, it sank within 12 minutes. Of its 1,195 crewmen, around 900 survived the initial shipwreck. Unluckily, they were stranded in shark-infested waters, and it took several days for Navy planes to locate them. By the time they had been rescued, only 317 men remained. The rest had been either eaten by sharks or died from saltwater poisoning, exposure, or dehydration. Today is remembered as the worst American naval disaster of World War II, and the ship is still missing. Number 8. The USS Cyclops, a victim of the Bermuda Triangle. It would be improper to finish an article on lost shipwrecks without at least mentioning the Bermuda Triangle. Our last entry is one of the most famous victims of this mysterious patch of the North Atlantic Ocean. The USS Cyclops was quickly commissioned when the USA joined the First World War and launched in May of 1910. It originally served along the east coast of the United States before being handed over to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service in January 1918. The ship was sailing from Rio de Janeiro to Baltimore when it disappeared. No one is sure why it sank, but there are several working theories. Some like to point to the fact it was traveling through the Bermuda Triangle when it sank, but there are more practical options. The first is that it is believed the USS Cyclops was overloaded when it sank, carrying 11,000 tons of manganese as well as 306 crew. Combined with the fact a storm was reported in the area around the time the ship sank, and the ship's class was known to have structural problems, this seems the most likely explanation. Another option is that since this was towards the end of the war, it could have been a German U-boat that sank the ship. A third theory is that the ship's captain was drunk at the helm and somehow scuttled the ship. Until explorers manage to find the Cyclops' final resting place, we won't know. These ships may have been lost for a long time, but there's still much hope they can be found. After all, Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endeavour, was long believed to be lost, but may have finally been found in 2022 with the use of advanced unmanned deep-sea submarines. As technology progresses, there is hope that all these ships can be found. So here we are at the end, and I will hopefully be back with you very soon again. Let's see if I can catch up on my schedule now for 2023 with more Eerie news. Until then.